I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, I might have said, yeah, you got these authoritarian, dictators. They set up the wise, KGB or whatever, and then they set up incentives to make sure the populace is always afraid, and it's all top down. And no, that's not how any of this works. It works because there's a 10% to 60% of the population which believes with all of their heart that the state and the thing that they're part of is for the righteous good, and that the others are unclean and dangerous to society.
Hey, Culminators. Good to see you again. I mean that metaphorically, of course, although our guest today might be able to explain, in drawing upon any number of his many disciplines, why I might actually be speaking beyond metaphor. Mark Changizi is, in fact, something of a visionary himself. He is somebody that I met on Twitter, and I got to know a little bit better when we did an interview together with our friend Randall Bach, who is also an unusual thinker. As you can see, Mark, one of the things that I think is holding Mark back from being fully appreciated is that stupid ass drawing. Because whenever I see him on Twitter, I'll show you in a second, it doesn't look to me like a person. It looks.
So my wife is an artist. There's about 7 or 8 of those of me that she just does in 15 minutes at a coffee shop, and so she has lots of she's an artist with tons of work, but there's like 6 or 7 of me, and so I just I don't use that one on.
Oh, but you used to have something, one from that series, and I'll tell you, whenever I looked at it, I thought it's someone who's kind of like doing a picture of himself as a lion. Somehow it looked to me like a lion picture. But I'm going to go back to the screen now because I'm glad that you interjected. So this way, the incredible tension of waiting to introduce you has been released. But guys, Mark is of Iranian extraction through his father. He just explained to me, which gives him certainly an interesting, and I watched his video, an interesting video about totalitarianism and Iran that he posted a couple of days ago. Scientist, author, entrepreneur. Guys, there are a lot of people who claim to be those kinds of things. He's for real, okay? These are his books. He does brain stuff. Let's take another look at the guy. I was on Tim Pool Monday night, and he said, Ron, he goes around the table and asks people to introduce themselves. I don't like introducing myself. So I just said, come on, Ron Coleman. Like, either you know me or you don't. If you don't know me, do a little work. I don't like asking people to introduce themselves if I can avoid it, because it's an awkward thing, and you're going to understate. He for all practical purposes, grew up in Virginia, degree in physics and mathematics. So we're talking about a lightweight here. PhD in math from the University of Maryland, all kinds of stuff, a fellowship at Caltech in theoretical neurobiology. And let me tell you something, it's about time someone got out of that practical neurobiology stuff and started getting a little bit theoretical, and I appreciate that. Human cognition, journal articles, publications like these kinds of things. I mean, he used to have a porn mustache, but listen, we all go through stuff. Mark, great to see you again. What an incredible moment.
I only had that mustache for one particular party. But yeah.
Only one particular film?
That's right.
Now, it's funny, you asked me, you're in Florida, right?
Oh yeah, Miami.
Yeah, you are. I think you might have told me, but I think I would have recognized that cityscape behind you. Everyone should be listening to your stuff instead of it's amazing to me how all your interests are painfully coming together. The way social media has affected the way so many people look at the world and the way events are perceived and experienced. And social media per se is not your focus, but one of the things I've always thought about social media is it's the closest that we can actually come to being able to read minds, because people, none of the things that prevent us from saying just whatever is in our heads work. Hardly any of them. Nearly, well, they work a lot less on social media than they work in real life. So we're seeing this really weird sociological, mass psychological experiment going on in real time, and it's affecting. Do you think it's having a change on the course of history? Because I think it is.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the illnesses of social media is that it does. So, for example, a young kid, 25 years old, interacting with you or me in real life is going to, even independent of knowing our resumes, is going to give us a certain kind of deference because of the age difference. There's a certain kinds of things that happen, and there will be emotional tone to the conversation in such a way that they will never act like they tend to on Twitter. The emotional tones that occur on Twitter are completely missing these things that they naturally instinctively do, unless they have some kind of emotional dysregulation. Right now, you can remember when Facebook tried to put these in for maybe 4 years ago or 3 years ago. You can pick from 8 different emotions instead of just like or retweet or whatever, or like it. You can do it 6 or 7 different emotions. There's this feeling like social media, big tech folks know that there needs to be greater emotional ability to emotionally signal to one another, and so there's some attempts to do so. But I think some of the reasons why it doesn't work as well as it should is because the normal emotional channels that we naturally communicate with, and it's our main language. My most recent book is Expressly Human, decoding the language of emotion. And we only have had in other books are on the origins of language itself. The origins of language is a cultural invention. It goes back relatively recently, but what we evolved, the language that we evolved to speak, is emotional expressions. And so you have a world now where a totally connected world where we have an illness in the way that we communicate with one another, because it's not allowing us to fully express. I mean, we can, of course, still pack in. We choose our words to pack in lots of emotional content. We now have, memes and GIFs that can really pack, the GIFs that we do, the animated GIFs, if you think about it, they're all emotions. They really convey better. Between memes, which are usually very emotional, and GIFs, this is a really modern way of trying to pack in the emotionality. So over time, culture is sort of evolving, the technology is evolving, better ways of packaging the kinds of emotional signals that we do, which regulate these kinds of power differences and reputation differences. But I would imagine
but they're really a simulacrum, right? I mean, they're not. The thing about emotions, about the way faces and bodies express or convey emotion, is subliminal.
Yeah.
To a large extent. I mean, if someone like me who's in the business of advocacy, I will sometimes simulate an emotion in order to create an effect. But in order for us to do that with GIFs or memes, it's got to go through here. It's like I knew a young man who was super intellectual and super sensitive, and he found himself a lot like I did, being friends with nerds, with weenies. And he knew that he wasn't cool, and he wanted to have a normal life, just also to appreciate being super intelligent. He didn't want to just hang around with weenies. He could tell they were weenies. So I always, and what I believe I saw him doing was analogizing from, he used he lacking the emotional RAM of a regular normal guy. He took it from processing speed and learned. He learned like somebody who is has to learn how to walk after a spine injury. He intellectually figured out how to simulate being a normal guy and completely pulled it off, even though he's he's at heart, he's really nerdy. That's what we're all doing. Like we're using all those nonverbal cues have to be turned into something verbal, or yes, now because so much of social media is visual, verbal or verbal adjacent. Though it's still two-dimensional because we're still going through the screens. Okay, so that you I interrupted you. All that leads to.
So, I mean, the importance of this is there's a couple ways to think about why it's so important. It's important not just because that's the channel by which we really communicate, but it's also important because the reason that social networks work is because they are reputation networks. It's by virtue of the arguments over time. And so if I make an argument and I make it very flat, I say proposition P could be true, but I'm not particularly confident, but I'm just putting this out. Hey, let's have a conversation. If it turns out false, I'm probably not going to lose any reputation over it because I didn't hype it up. But instead I say propositions P is true. And do you know who I am? Do you have any idea who I am? Right now, it turns out I'm wrong. I've shoved all of these chips, pride, because I've not only said P, proposition P, but I pushed in all of this saying, I'm so great. Like I really am so confident. And it turns out that I'm wrong. I lose a lot of chips. If I instead say, Ron Coleman, you're wrong. You completely have no freaking idea what you're talking about, right? Now, if it turns out I'm wrong too, I've also done a kind of disdain for you. So these kinds of, whether it's confidence about myself or disdain for the opponent, I can easily become humiliated depending upon, but I can also be, turn out to win. If it turns out that I win, I bet a lot of reputation, either on you being an idiot or me being great. I can also turn out to, so all what emotional expressions do is the poker game that is constantly being played in the social network. We are able to, and if I'm being really humble, I say, look, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like maybe I realize you know more than me. So look, actually, I don't know what I'm talking about. So I'm kind of pulling chips off the table. I'm sort of backing down. I'm saying, I don't really want to bet these after all. Something you can't do in poker, but you can do in real life, right? So we do all these things the entire time.
Well, don't you do that in poker when you fold?
Yeah, but you can't actually take that's just agreeing to the other guy. That's saying, I agree that your hand is bigger than mine.
What? Right? For that hand, you lost those chips, but you are making an investment in your overall reputation and how you are reckoned as a bettor for future hands.
Definitely, yeah. But there's a sense in which the mathematics that governs emotional expressions and the emotional expression, the language that all social animals need is two full dimensions, whereas poker is sort of only one half dimension. I can just bet that my hand's stronger than yours. I can't unbet. I can't ever pull it off the table. And when I am betting that mine is stronger than yours, you can't tell in poker whether I'm saying mine is strong or whether I'm saying yours is weak. Anyway, so it turns out it's sort of a smaller dimensional space, whereas the full dimensions that we speak in emotional expression terms is about conveying confidence or lack of confidence in my claim or in your claims in these various ways. And it's these conversations, all of the emotional content we just see it as propositions. Hey, I said this proposition, you said this proposition, and then how dare they put any emotional content on it on top? That's kind of ridiculous that they're doing it. No, that's the point. Statistics is all about saying proposition P, and not only that, but it has a significance that's less than 0.05 or something like this. But the language that we humans speak to one another is conveyed and absorbed by virtue of these emotional expressions, which convey your perceived or your claimed levels of confidence or unconfidence, lack of confidence in it. And so it's by virtue of making strong claims and being strong and then losing reputation, or vice versa, or the other way around, that over time, some folks in the social network rise in reputation if it's functioning as it should. So it's not just about making sure these emotional expressions are there so that people can fully understand everybody's emotions and we're all in tune with one another, right? It's not about that. I mean, it is about that, but unless you have the ability to do those sorts of emotional expressions, then you can't properly decide whether, was he really saying it? How strongly was he saying it, so that we can figure out how much to knock him for being wrong. And of course, there's other problems with social networks too. We're designed for social networks with 200 people, maybe 20 to 200, 500, maybe. Now we have social networks with millions and hundreds of millions of people. We need to have mechanisms that allow us to better keep track of the shit people say so that we can remember to knock them, And
right. So there's an accountability problem.
Right.
And there's this paradox of networking. I used to lecture on networking. Networks there's an inherent power of a large network compared to a smaller network, but the larger a network gets, the less relevant membership in that network is to your assessment of reputation. And when I used to head a networking group for Princetonians, Princeton alumni, who were displaced by 9/11 in New York City. And so I could really speak the language I could speak the language that people understood in that room. If someone calls you up in those days or sends you an email, I'm a Princeton alumnus, or even we were in the same class, I'm automatically inclined to listen. Never met him before, but we have something in common and something that we both value. Now you're going to include all Ivy Leaguers? Okay, I mean, which was how Facebook started out after all. The bigger the network gets, when someone is a connection of mine on LinkedIn or Facebook, it's fairly meaningless because we're talking thousands and thousands of people, and the shared affection, the shared emotional connection, and the implied reputation and the accountability are more and more and more attenuated.
Right.
So
now, yeah, go on.
No, I want to hear. I actually wanted to hand it back to you.
Yeah. So even in real life, before social networks, of course, we have social networks that span all of society in some sense. Of course, there's a lot more full connectivity now going on than there would have been when it was just social connections. But we would have had the public square and the town public square, and a lot of folks there knew one another. But there would often be representatives. Like, hey, Doug is really into it. He goes to the Capitol and interacts with all of the other representatives from the other town squares, and he argues with them. So he's a sort of a higher reputation folks from our town square is interacting with a bunch of other Dougs and Susies at the big city. And amongst those, there's higher reputation ones, which may get voted into, going into so this, the very representational system that nations tend to build are ways of hierarchically dealing with it, so that at any given time, the number of people in your social network that you have to deal with is hierarchically kept small. And then, the next hierarchy keeps it small again. I mean, brains deal with this kind of thing. Visual hierarchies, you have all of these sort of hierarchies so that you can deal with these kinds of connectivity sorts of issues. And I don't know data for this, but I would suspect that Twitter and all of these social networks end up with it being incredibly messy, but they end up with a lot of the high ranked people are disproportionately connected to one another. And of course, everybody connects to them. But you end up with sort of higher tiers of people with, let's say, 50,000, 30 to 80,000. There's a lot of connectivity between them. And then you get to 150, it's another kind of tier, smaller number. And there's probably some of the similar kinds of hierarchical structures mimicking what would have happened then. And to the extent that happens and it self-organizes that way, that keeps people's effective connectivity being in the hundreds range of their people that they really know and recognize, at least their profile images, even as you go up. So Elon might have 200 or 300 people that he realistically interacts with. He ignores the other 9 million.
So, and of course, we're being deprived of the visual cues. I mean, back when there was some rationale to verification on Twitter, even though it was also instantly abused for political reasons. But when you saw that someone had a blue check, that told you that someone who is in charge of the network or who has authority within the network reckons that person as high status for some mysterious reason. Outside of that, in meat space, we used to look at how a person dressed and the kind of shoes that he wore, and the kind of cloak that he wore in ancient times, and the accent that his Latin was spoken with, or whether his Greek was good. All these different sorts of things that now they've all been flattened out. Now, again, that benefits guys like you and me to some extent, because we're really intellectual and we're really verbal. And verbal is the number one thing on Twitter. And like you said, if you can play the poker game, it's great that you use the example of backing off from, because I just did that this morning. I commented on some self-defense question that was raised by a video of somebody shooting somebody else. And someone said something really kind of out there, and I said, that sounds kind of out there. And then someone asked a more pointed question. I said, I don't know. Listen, I don't know about that stuff. And it was a very conscious decision, as you say. I never quite thought of it that way, of pulling chips off the table and saying, I'm prepared to discuss this on a high level, but not there's stuff that I'm detail wise, I'll take on anyone, but not that. All right. So now we see the social network phenomenon. How is that affecting, in your view, the way the world is spinning?
Yeah, I mean, so as you know, and for COVID, you could, what we witnessed during COVID, and a lot of the reasons that folks, to the extent that anyone knows me outside of my science stuff, that talks kind of the science world where I had some bit of following. Another whole crew of people have gotten to know me through COVID, and I was one of the folks from the very beginning that was arguing, what the heck is going on? None of this makes sense. These are massive civil liberties violations. There's no cost-benefit analyses. This is obviously a mass hysteria from the start. And what the only good thing about all of that, and it's not good, but the only good thing about it is that most of us have never experienced a totalitarianism ourselves. These kinds of mass hysterias that lead to totalitarianism, where a lot of people don't really understand what totalitarianism is, and I think even the definitions don't get it right. There's authoritarianism, which is some kind of government trying to top-down control the population. This happens, there's a new coup in some African country, and there's an authoritarian new government. But governments can't top-down do much. They're like the DMV, they're disorganized, they don't know what they're doing. It only typically is dangerous when there's a significant, at least minority of strident, righteous folks that are behind it. And there's usually some kind of cult-like thing when the new dictator has been carried on the backs of a significant part of the populace. That's when it's dangerous. And that's totalitarianism, in the sense that you're afraid that your neighbors are going to report you, your children might report you. And this is the first time that I think most of the world experiences. My family in Iran experiences this. That's a totalitarian state. You can't, if you walk down with a little bit of your hair showing as a woman, people on the street that don't work for the government will attack you. And there's hundreds of videos, just like the maskers saying, hey, why aren't you wearing a mask? Same stuff. People in Iran deal with this their whole lives, right? That's a totalitarian, the Cultural Revolution in China, totalitarianism, Germany. So all of these things that have typically happened in other countries, we say, well, Chinese are, far away, Eastern culture. Germans, they're strict. We come up with bullshit. They're totally Western and strict. But we come up with some bullcrap reason for why it couldn't happen here, because they're a little strict, and we make like stereotypical jokes about, and Iranians are a Muslim country. No, it can happen to anybody. And we saw it spread in a COVID medical a totalitarian state. And of course, it's weak. What we suffered compared to the other examples is small, but it happened worldwide. In terms of its widespread, it happened worldwide. Everybody got to experience it. I think it convinces people that this is a problem that's not just for those foreigners, right? It can happen to any of us. And I think that's the big moral for me of this, is how to stop these sorts of things, because a lot of the folks on the anti-lockdown side have come to believe that it's all a pandemic. This was all staged on purpose from 20 years of planning. And no, if this is your solution, you're not going to address the problem. And the problem is that people wanted this. You can remove the WHO and you can remove Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab, and there's just other ones are going to pop into place because people want it.
Okay, I'm really glad you said this, because my next question to you was going to be, and I guess it still is, when we think of totalitarianism, we think of it as a phenomenon that serves the one or handful of ones at the top, and that, it basically being authoritarianism plus. Mao wants this, Stalin wants this, Hitler wants this. You're saying that totalitarianism is
decentralized authoritarianism is what I would say. It's decentralized, distributed, just like blockchain, all of this kind of world of understanding decentralization and That's really what it is. It's authoritarianism that's gotten decentralized across the population, and it's
So,
everywhere. It's all around you.
so it's not merely the case, which I might have thought, that people stop you in Iran if you're a woman showing hair because they're afraid that if they don't, as was the case certainly in the Soviet Union, if you don't denounce a transgressor, you may be on the list of people who observed the transgression and did not desist. So therefore, your fear is of Big Brother. But what we saw, and what you're saying actually sheds light on these other, what we think of as Big Brother phenomena. What we saw during COVID was the people in the 7-Eleven who were yelling at you for not wearing a mask or for letting your nose poke out of your mask. They weren't afraid of that. They weren't afraid that they were going to get in trouble for not stopping you. It was an absolutely sincere totalitarian impulse on their parts.
Right, right, right. That's what I think. I had some vague impression about this, but I think if you had asked me 10 years ago, I might have said, yeah, you got these authoritarian, dictators. They set up the wise, KGB or whatever, and then they set up incentives to make sure the populace is always afraid, and it's all top down. And no, that's not how any of this works. It works because there's a 10% to 60% of the population which believes with all of their heart that the state and the thing that they're part of is for the righteous good, and that the others are unclean and dangerous to society.
And your video from earlier this week, or maybe I guess it was the end of last week, you make the point that there's a great paradox in totalitarianism, which is that its victims are its supporters. Was that the point? I mean, or the title of it?
I mean, I say that the victims of totalitarianism are often that is the people that end up. So let's just give it some meat in the case of Gaza, right? So as an Iranians, almost each of us Iranians, and of course there's counterexamples because even in Iran, 20% maybe to 30% of Iranians really still support the Islamic Republic, the mullahs, but most Iranians do not. Most Iranians identify with Gaza and say, and so the idea that these Western pro-Palestinian folks are being pro-Islamic Republic and pro-Hamas blows our mind. Like, no, the average Gazan, in spite of all these polls you think that you're hearing, you can't trust polls in a totalitarian state. No one is going to sit down and take an supposedly anonymous poll. First of all, they show up to your house. That means your neighbors are seeing some AP or whatever show up to your house and walk in. They know that something's weird. You're going to make sure that all of your answers, first of all, you're going to avoid ever letting them even get near your house. You're going to pretend not to be home. Oh, I got to go. Because you don't want to ever be accused of that. Your life is on the line. None of these polls can possibly be trusted. Now, of course, there's way too many Gazans that probably support Hamas. I'm not saying that there's not, but it could be 40%, it could be 70%, but there's massive confounds in these supposed polls. They didn't, they elected Hamas. No, they didn't elect Hamas. Hamas, were people able to run against them without worrying that their family would be killed? And the obvious answer is no. As soon as they were elected, they murdered the opposition. Nobody was free to run against them on let's say, a freedom or a peace or an anti-Islamist platform, right? There is no freedom, and they haven't had even a fake election since. So you have, but yet the supposedly pro-Gazan Westerners are pro-Hamas, which is exactly the main oppressor of Gazans, right? And they're pro-IRI, which is the main oppressor of another massive group of Muslims, the Iranians. So you end up with the oppressed people in these Muslim dictatorships, and the supposed backers of them, they're walking around saying, yeah, we support you. You're like, no, you're supporting our dictatorship, in both cases. So, and of course, so the pro-Palestinian ones are supporting the very dictatorship that oppresses them. And then the enemy, in this case, the United, let's say Israel, a lot of Israel, the IDF gets it. I believe the IDF, they're dealing with civilians on the ground in Gaza all the time. They really do want to bring in food. They're close enough to the ground that they're not able to imagine that the average Gazan is the same as Hamas. There's differences, I mean, there's a lot of Gazans that are Hamas. I'm not saying that aren't, but they get it. There's lots of people that just say this sucks for us because we're being, but some Israelis just find it simpler to say, it's a lot simpler if we just lump them all in as one thing. So I'm arguing, look, Gazans don't equal Hamas, just like Iranians don't equal the IRI. And people on both ends are saying, no, that's not true. And they all want to argue that they're the exact same, which is exactly the nightmare for the oppressed in a totalitarian state. Nobody's on their side.
And is social media making this worse? I would think that it is.
I think that it has to be, or I mean, there's probably many dimensions in which it's making it worse. Certainly, the most obvious is that, and going back to the COVID, was the degree to which it spread. So there's two things that we learned at COVID. It is not just those weird cultural people. We come up with some post hoc generalization, but it's also it used to spread to the edges of its boundaries and maybe spill over and mess up some neighboring countries a little bit, but now it just spreads worldwide. So this is the first time we saw something like this immediately spread in a week. Well, I mean, just instantaneously. It just happened all over the world all at once, with all of these, immediate spikes of excess deaths in March all over the world. A virus doesn't simultaneously hit disparate parts of the world all at once, right? This was mass hysteria, iatrogenic, self-induced deaths.
So what's the role? I mean, we've said that totalitarianism is sort of a democratization of ideological extremism. But what happens to elites in that? Because as I'm asking the question, I'm wondering if the reaction of the elites to this phenomenon, which was so awful, and the doubling down, sounds as if it was an attempt to assert a leadership role where, in fact, there was really a sort of organic mass hysteria phenomenon going on. So elites unable to, in other words, I always thought, and I can't back this up, but that there was in the brain of Donald Trump in early 2020, a small still voice saying, this sounds a little crazy, but we got to, all the scientists are telling me this, and I've got to look like I'm in charge.
Yeah.
And that down the line, everyone is saying, look, this is where everything's going. We need to look like we're taking people there in order to retain that reputational power. That means everything to people, in those categories. So you have Fauci. Let's forget about his own personal interests and financial interests, but all these people, all these governors, and all these heads of state buying in, just disregarding all normal protocols of how decisions are made, just as you were describing before.
Yeah, and it's easy to potentially say that they're consciously thinking through that in order to maintain my reputation, I have to.
No,
it's
exactly.
not like that.
It's not conscious. That's just not how people operate. But I think of the medical profession in particular. And when I was in law school, the medical school and the law school at Northwestern were there. I managed to mention both of my fancy schools since I mentioned yours. Were together in Chicago. The rest of the campus was in Evanston. And we in the law school had a nicer, newer library than the medical school. And the medical school students would sometimes come in and study in our place. And there was all this, we would tease them because they were taking up our spaces, but they were definitely a different sort of person. And they tended, and what I learned about medicine is that doctors don't tend to be necessarily courageous people. They tend, they're very good at learning really important stuff, but the medical profession so profoundly failed. But not only at the institutional level, all the elite members, but how many doctors' offices do you still go into where they're requiring masks in 2024? It's only beginning to fall off.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. So you mean doctors are not, the goal of a doctor is not to constantly challenge the status quo in the standard practice. Whereas there's the but they're constantly about questioning it and looking for angles and looking for space.
I mean, right.
But
And the ones who accommodate themselves do very well in both professions.
yeah.
But
did lawyers, is there a higher rate of lawyers that saw through this? I suspect there's not,
No, I don't think so at all. I don't
Yeah.
think so. No, because I think what happens is the higher the too speculative, way too speculative. But now what's the result in 4 years out? Do we at least have we learned anything that we can put to use from what happened, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is things that I've certainly thought a lot about. I don't claim to have big answers yet, but there's certainly some of the main and simplest things are that civil liberties, really every generation needs to be retaught the purpose of civil liberties. Civil liberties are there for the dangerous emergencies, the perceived emergencies. That's the only reason that we have them. Just like a free expression is for your most hated enemies. That's the whole point. There's no reason to even talk about free expression if we're only talking about people whose voices you like to hear. We wouldn't need a principle for that, because we all don't mind. It's only when we have perceived dangers and we feel like the world is being hurt by our enemies that we want to suddenly stop or halt their civil liberties. So I've done probably 25, 30, many dozens of science moments trying to come at civil liberties from varying different kinds of angles to try to drive it home in ways that people aren't typically thinking about, as well as 100 episodes on free expression. So I think really this is something it's very intuitive to people that civil liberties are something that has to be balanced. And so as soon as you have the notion that they're not deontological constraints, that is firm constraints, but are instead something that has to be balanced amongst the many other utilities, then suddenly, there's always something that needs to be done. There's always starving people. There's always someone being attacked. There's always some danger, right? In which case, civil liberties are always at stake because they're just one of the things that you're balancing. Another,
right, so that's sort of an academic, moral answer, but on a more practical level, what kind of, maybe that was the next thing you were going to say. The thing about you, Mark, is that you've always got something more to say, because you've got a lot. I mean, you've got a lot of windows open at the same time, because you're drawing on a lot of different areas of interest.
Well, I mean, another moral to me about the United States relative to other countries was that we had federalism, which is one of the few things that looks like it came out really in good standing. When you get mass hysteria, most of these floodwaters of these memes of this new righteous communities just floods right over all of these supposed civil liberty protections. They just go right over it. But by virtue of the natural statistical properties of variability from state to state and a little bit of different cultural milieu in each state, we ended up with, at first Florida was actually pretty authoritarian. But by end of summer, beginning of late 2020, it kind of turned around really quick, and it got its head in order. And so there were places in the United States you could go. So I moved from Ohio to Miami after tried this move. It took us 22 years before we'd get here. But you had places with 50 different states. You have enough variability that there was some place to flee to. Now, you also had places of federalism, like in Canada and Australia, but I think the numbers of provinces and territories were so small that it just seemed that they all ended up bouncing as one, and there was really nowhere to run. But so I think one of the few things that came out really well was all of these supposed protections and balances of power in the United States failed, but federalism, at the end of the day, worked because of laws of large numbers or something like this. It's just sort of a mathematical. There was enough variability that it allowed some independent cultural evolution to occur, and that was a real savior. A lot of people would email me constantly from Europe, and just like they had nowhere to run. They felt helpless.
So that's a plus on social media, right? Because you could certainly, I think you can see that almost the same thing happening if we scroll back to the 80s and there's no social media, but the New York Times and the Washington Post, all right, I guess you can't really, just like any time travel scenario, if you go back to say, well, what would the elite media have done that would have been any different if that's all you had were gate-kept media? Well, first of all, the New York Times and the Washington Post would not be as radically left as they are now, or radically statist as they are now, because they have been forced into that corner by social media. I don't mean forced morally, but commercially. They made a decision that's the only way they can survive is with this highly curated, highly ideological readership that's going to pay. But you do have channels available to you today that you didn't have, discussions like this and your videos and the stuff that you put out. I mean, first of all, that's something else that the United States, I think, comes out smelling like a rose with. The free expression stuff, there were some really big failures there, but most of us recognize them as failures. I'll be super glad when the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general recognize them as failures. A lot of censorship was rationalized and justified by the supposed emergency, which was supposed to, as you say, we're combining two things, right? Civil liberties are supposed to be because of emergency, and free speech is supposed to be because of speech you don't want to hear. The challenge here was the civil liberty of free speech in an emergency. And because of this weird police powers loophole in the unwritten Constitution, the judiciary mostly blew it. But I think culturally, most people who are serious thinkers and who are open to discussion and persuasion on this recognize some really, really mistaken stuff happened in this process in terms of censorship.
I hope that you're right. My own impression from the left is not that what they so far don't believe that they've made any mistakes in this regard.
Well, I don't think they're not serious thinkers anymore. I mean, they have abandoned their mass hysteria has not ended.
Yeah.
Mark, believe it or not, it's been 3/4 of an hour. This is exactly what happened with Randy. We could do this all day. You make you're not in an academic post now, right?
That's right.
Correct. You run your company. You ran it. You sold it. What's?
I have a company, VNO Optics. What I still run sort of vein finder glasses, colorblind glasses, coming out of my discovery that why we evolved color vision. It's actually to see blood under the skin, to see emotions enough. And then I have a sort of a incubator. So there's other companies that are coming out, and I'll let you know more about, and as well as another couple books in the works.
You are, listen, my experience has been that the vast majority of people who use the word polymath on their own websites can pull it off. Everything I've seen and heard from you suggests to me that you can. And, I really hate having to acknowledge when someone is smarter than I am, but
no, just different. Instead of studying one vertical, I happen to just sort of went horizontally. But yeah,
I appreciate it. The fact is, you got a lot. You're thinking big picture in a way that in a polymathematical kind of way, and you have to, because so much. What's fascinating is that the approaches like yours, and I mean the multiple approaches of yours, and taking a theoretical approach to the things that are going on in the world and analogizing them to and linking them to physiological, neurological, and psychological phenomena is really the only way to truly understand it. And there are only a handful of people who could even try to do so. And Mark, I thank you very much for your continued efforts in doing that and sharing it, and for culminating with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Catch you later.